Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another NICR, National Institute for Congestion Reduction webinar. It is my pleasure to welcome you to what role can built environment and incentives play in supporting pooling with shared mobility, a photo voice study in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is my pleasure to welcome Susan Shanahan. Let me tell you a little bit more about Susan. Susan is a pioneer in innovative mobility strategies. She was among the first to research and write about changing dynamics in shared mobility and likely scenarios automated vehicles might gain prominence. She's a professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the co-director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center of the in the Institute of Transportation Studies, Berkeley, and the director of the University of California's ITS, Resilient and Mobility Innovative. She has a PhD from UC Davis and an MS, a Master's Degree of Science from the University of Rochester. She has authored 76 journal articles, over 125 reports and preceding articles, and 19 chapters, and co-edited 2 books. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Susan.
Much, Stephanie. It's great to be here today and share some brand new research that we've conducted on understanding curb management and targeted incentive policies to increase the use of pooling in transportation network companies alongside public transit linkages between public transit and TNCs. So what I'd like to do, Stephanie, is to start with some polling of the audience. So hopefully all of you can see the questions I've prepared for you today, and I'll walk through them. If you can take a moment to answer them, I thought would be fun is after the end of my presentation, we can go through those together. So the first question is, what are some concerns you have with sharing TNC rides? So these are the pooled rides, and you can see a variety of choices, and I can see people are diving into answering that question. The second question is, what are a few locations that you think could benefit from designated TNC stops? And so there's a variety of locations for you to think about in that context. Next question, what are some elements of your ideal pooled TNC ride experience? So think about things like trip time, pickup location, all of those types of answers. And then finally, if you were ordering a TNC for someone else, for example, somebody in your family, would your concerns change when you order in contrast to ordering a TNC for yourself? All right, so thanks so much for participating in the poll. And all of these questions are really relevant to the presentation today, so it'll be fun for us to revisit that at the end of the talk. So today I want to introduce you to our research center and the team that conducted this research with me. I'm going to provide you with the background and motivation for the project, some research questions, walk you through the methodological approach, key findings, future research areas, and then some just overall key takeaways from this particular project. So I have had the pleasure for about 15 years of co-directing a center called the Transportation Sustainability Research Center. And we do a lot of work really focused on this issue of sustainability and trying to do evidence-based work that can really help with identifying strategies and policies that are sort of at the nexus of transportation technology, policy, and human behavior. And so we do a lot of work that we hope is going to help policymakers and planners, including this particular study. So the team that joined me on this effort include Adam Cohen, who is a senior research manager with our group, Jacqueline Broader, who's a research associate, and Wesley Darling, who is now a PhD student. He was a master's student when he did this research with us at UC Berkeley. What I want to do is start with some terms because I'm going to be using quite a few of these, and they're really relevant to the motivation of this work, but also the content of this work. So when I use the term transportation network company, I'm referring to the services that have been referred to as ride sourcing or ride hail. People are using on-demand platforms. I typically use the term TNC these days because across the globe, that's the common terminology. And that is definitely the terminology that's used in the vast majority of policy and planning materials. The first thing I want to talk about is direct pooling. So this is the idea that you go from your origin destination without having to walk to a pickup or drop pickup location. Indirect pooling trip is one, think of it like a taxi stand kind of experience where someone would either be routed virtually to a collective area for indirect pooling, or there would be a designated place. So that's indirect pooling. One of the things that we've been doing research on for a while is TNC pooling. And one of our research studies, which is noted here, what we identified was that there are pretty interesting differences between frequent users and periodic users. So think of a frequent user as somebody who really relies on TNCs quite a bit. So they're using them more than 3 times per week. And periodic users are people who are much less than that and often are using them for a trip to the airport or a business trip or something like that. So those differences, I think, are quite important as we think about curb management, as we think about the use of incentives and overall policy and planning when it comes to TNCs, because all users are not the same in terms of their socioeconomics, but also their motivations. So now the background on the project. So what we really wanted to do was hone in on this notion of pooling, indirect pooling, direct pooling, and also highlighting differences between frequent TNC users and less frequent users, to really look at the role of the built environment alongside targeted incentives that could encourage people to pool. And then in addition, looking at the linkages between TNCs and public transit. So we really came to this with the opportunity to look at, could we increase pooling? Could we increase first mile and last mile linkages to public transit as a mechanism to lessen congestion, energy use, emissions, and overall reliance on private vehicle ownership? With a keen eye towards this notion, can we move the needle towards higher occupancy in TNC vehicles? And ultimately, our goal was to identify strategies that could be leveraged in the context of policy and planning that could help to increase pooling and attain other co-benefits. So the research questions are pretty simple. Why are more people not taking pooling? And so I want to just preface this that we wrote this proposal prior to the pandemic. We did this work during the pandemic. And I think as many of you know that when the pandemic hit, pooling decreased, in part because, not in part, entirely because this was an option that was no longer allowed. So when we're doing this research and we're thinking about this research, it is in the context of an environment in which pooled TNCs are an option. And people who were part of this study are people who were very familiar with this notion before the pandemic. How do different factors in the pooled TNC experience impact a person's decision to pool? And I've asked you some of those questions at the beginning of this webinar. What differences exist between frequent and periodic TNC users? Again, that comes out of prior research that we've done. And then fourth, how can TNC users be encouraged to share rides or connect to public transit with a first mile, last mile component? This is an overview of the methodological approach. So we began by doing a pretty deep review of the literature particularly around shared mobility, pooling, barriers to TNC use, safety, overall attitudes towards pricing and discounts and curb management. That's been a growing area of interest, as many of you know. We also did quite a bit of lit review work on the photo voice methodology. I used that myself before, and I'll be talking more about that. So then we conducted expert interviews, and we talked to experts in both the areas of shared mobility and pooling, but also in the areas of photo voice, people who had a lot of deep expertise in this particular method that hasn't really been used a lot in transportation, if at all. And then we next worked with actual TNC users who fall into those two categories of frequent and periodic users. And then ultimately we pulled everybody together for a workshop that included policy and planning experts as well as private companies. So some of the key findings from the lit review. Time, safety, and access are all barriers to widespread TNC pooling. Not terribly surprising, but this is documented. Improvements to curb management strategies in the built environment, as well as incentives, can be tools for addressing those barriers. Only a few prior studies have actually engaged TNC users in a qualitative manner that we were able to find. So a lot of the TNC studies tend to be much more quantitative in nature, using surveys or activity types of data. And no prior studies from our knowledge have explored the safety of waiting for a TNC or TNC pickup and drop-off location perceptions. So this study really honed in on that particular area. Expert interviews. So we conducted interviews, as I mentioned, with people who are experts in photo voice. This was extremely helpful in helping us think about modifying this technique for transportation and also modifying this technique to not be done in person, but to be done via a Zoom-based platform, but still having people go out and take photographs. We also interviewed 10 pooling experts. All of these experts shared best practices. We got best practices on photo voice, as well as ideas for how to administer this particular method during COVID. That was extremely helpful to us. And we also found from our experts in the pooling space, TNC space, opportunities and challenges for pooling, particularly around wait times, built environment, infrastructure, public transit connections, incentives, etc. So I've walked through a lot of this earlier, but this is a more detailed overview of the photo voice method itself. So we started with recruitment on Craigslist, and we honed in on people who lived in the San Francisco Bay Area because the project was envisioned to actually be done live with them. So we would have previously gone out with them as they took the photographs. And we selected people based on their experience with TNC use, as well as categorizing them into frequent and periodic users. They had to be able to take these photos and be willing to take these walks for us, and to also be able to participate in a Zoom teleconferencing event. So they went out and they took these photographs. They visited 3 TNC pickup locations. At each of these, they took a minimum of 5 pictures of the built environment at each location. And they developed a 1 to 2 sentence caption for each photo. And they shared their photos with us, the research team. After that, we had our small group discussions, and about 2 to 3 people participated in about 5 of those. One had a solo discussion with us, and they talked through their photographs with us. And they also, if they were in a small group format, reacted to each other's photos and answered a variety of questions that we had to pose to them about public transit linkages and incentives. And then finally, we moved into that workshop which was really fabulous, by the way. I think everybody really enjoyed this. The photos were shared again, but now we had experts in the field, the companies themselves, policymakers and planners attend and interact with the user group. And from that, we were able to develop key takeaways, findings, and strategies, research recommendations. So we had 15 TNC users total, 7 frequent, 8 periodic, 8 males, 7 females. And as I noted, we had about 5 1.5 hour small group discussions, and then 1 solo discussion with an individual. So the user stakeholder workshop that just happened recently in July. So we had 12 of our participants with us and 5 transportation stakeholders representing private sector, NGOs, and public sector. And that was a 2-hour workshop conducted on Zoom. The participants got a chance to present their photo voice pictures and findings and recommendations, and to have a dynamic discussion about how to improve the curb and built environment experiences at public transit, as well as discussing the role of incentives. And as I mentioned, all of this came together to inform the results that I'm presenting today. So now you get to see some of the photos. So these are some highlights. With respect to the built environment, what we found across the board was that users prefer to wait in areas with wide sidewalks and open visibility of the road where it is easy to connect with drivers. So what you can see from these photographs is they do depict this, and this was confirmed through small group discussions, but also that workshop itself. That's really their preference. Users also prefer pickup spots located near retail opportunities and in safe neighborhoods that are away from homeless encampments. I'll tell you that there was a lot of discussion about safety, about concerns from individuals that someone might even come up and take their smartphone away as they waited for a ride, because a lot of users are on their phones as they wait for the TNC to come up. And in the Bay Area, as in many places across the country, there are a lot of increases in homelessness. And so this was something we talked a lot about, was that safety and security feelings as being really important, and barriers to feeling comfortable with pickup spots. Then users like waiting at pickup locations that are well lit. So we often found these pictures of really well-lit locations, often having shelters or coverings, and having benches or seating available. We also found that people really liked the idea of benches that faced the road instead of having their backs to the road so that they could see what was coming. So that was another observation. Next, I want to take us into some more analysis that came out. Is one of the things that we did not go into this analysis hypothesizing that there would be significant differences between male and female users. Now, you might say, Susan, that's obvious, but the research itself really showed how important this was. We did go into this research, as I mentioned, thinking that there would be differences between the frequent TNC users and the periodic. So what you can see here in terms of waiting location is male users, safe area to look at the phone. They really want to be on their phone while they're waiting for that TNC, but they want it to be safe. We found female users really like to be waiting in or near retail. So a lot of these people would actually be inside a building waiting for that TNC to come in. Waiting environments, low foot traffic areas are preferred for the men, and well-traveled areas for women, and open or transparent shelters. So a notion that if we were to develop fixed pickup locations, that they might be open or transparent in nature. Next, differences between frequent users and periodic users. So of course I was going to look at this. Travel preferences. The frequent users use TNCs much more so to connect to public transit and are more likely to take indirect pool trips. So that means they're willing to walk. The periodic users are much more likely to take direct TNC trips, so point-to-point, pooled, and private. Infrastructure preferences. So the frequent users, locations with easy driver access, and they were less concerned about built environment features or amenities. We found them to actually kind of go with the flow and were less demanding in terms of, we would like this and that is in terms of our amenities. So I think it might have something to do with their frequency of use. Periodic users really favor wide sidewalks, lighting, and low foot traffic. In terms of incentive preferences, our frequent users really like the idea of affinity type programs for rewarding people who take a lot of trips and bundled trip discounts. And the periodic users, not surprisingly, favor individual trip discounts because they're not frequent users. So next I want to move into our recommendations for curb management strategies. So coming out of this workshop, so this is a collective processing, not just of those TNC users, but of our experts in the public and private sectors and NGOs, built environment changes. Employ more curb markings and signage, wayfinding, strong lighting to create designated pickup drop-off areas, particularly on busy streets and near popular destinations. So making some changes to really encourage that pooling, make it easier for people to find those indirect pooling locations. Partnerships. Support partnerships between TNCs, local retailers to designate stores as possible waiting locations to support that safety as well as that pooling. And app locations, assisting TNCs in offering designated pickup areas and safe waiting locations in app, and prioritizing trip routing to these locations. So really working together to figure out on the public side and the private side where to designate these areas, make sure they're safe, and provide all of the wayfinding and in-app features. And then finally, in-app safety features. Encourage TNCs to incorporate in-app safety features to provide riders with more upfront trip information, options to share trip information with emergency contacts, and the location of nearby security personnel. So that is picking up a lot of the safety discussion that we had. Next, moving into recommendations associated with policy, pricing, and incentives. So incentives, develop your incentive packages to encourage pooling. This could include regular and consistent trips, for example, to workplaces or schools, non-urgent trips to retailers or recreational areas, as well as incentives to trips to and from popular destinations, such as event venues and airports. Integrated fare payment may not surprise you, facilitating those partnerships to integrate fares and providing discounts for multimodal trips, linkages to public transit, but to other locations, even airports. The use of advanced technology, such as near-field communication technology, could be used to enable fare payments for multiple trips, for trips on multiple modes. So payment of one whole trip in one shot. And then when we look at public transit connections, facilitating public transit by incorporating public transit trip schedules, stop and station locations, and also wayfinding directions in TNC apps. Finally, I want to talk about areas for future research. So service equity, so this also came up, is better understanding how to address service inequities that can arise due to user-selected safety preferences and geofencing. So for example, reduced service in areas that are perceived as less desirable. So ensuring that we look across the board, not just at those high frequency locations, but all over the place where people pick up TNCs. Goal alignment. So how do we align incentives between TNC drivers who are really motivated to complete trips, get people in and out of those vehicles quickly, and the TNC users who are more motivated by their personal safety and comfort in their rides? So Some ideas that came up is encouraging drivers to focus on customer trip satisfaction over total number of trips through changed policies. And then gender equity. This was a finding of the study that male users and female users felt differently. So exploring strategies to address the root causes of those gender-based differences in terms of safety perceptions. So more thought about things like providing females with travel incentives to better understand how their travel patterns change based on those types of incentives. So overall, here's some of our key takeaways. The photo voice method. So this was new to us. We really enjoyed working with it. All of our partners seemed to really enjoy it as well. We found it a really useful tool to engage our users in collecting data and helping us understand and see the world through their eyes, through their photographs. It helped us to understand why users choose to pool and to connect TNCs to public transit and why they don't, and what those built environment and safety features might be that are key barriers. And the role of incentives in shifting possible behaviors more towards pooling and public transit linkages. Network development. By developing a network of partners and incentives, we think we could create more safe waiting environments to support pooling, and that by working all together, including the users of these services, could come up with more strategies that are targeted at addressing a number of their concerns. And this could potentially lead to more pooling and more positive externalities like decreased congestion and lower emissions. In terms of future research, we think lots of opportunities to focus on pooling of mobility services alongside social equity considerations, taking more focus on gender-based safety perceptions, and doing more and more research, because this was really indeed an exploratory study. So lots of opportunities for more work. So as I wrap up, I want to make sure to thank all of the TNC users that participated in this study. They were so vital to all of the results, and all of the stakeholders that participated alongside us with this work. It was really a team effort and one of partnership. And then I wanted to share this reference with you. This was the study that essentially motivated this study to come about, where we were seeing clear differences between frequent TNC users and non-frequent TNC users. So now I'd like to move us into Q&A, but before I do that, Stephanie, I would love to see the results of our poll. Great. So it looks like we got them up. So our first question was, what are some concerns you have with sharing TNC rides? So wait times lengthened, safety security, followed by driving times lengthened. And 2 people had some other considerations that were not in that list. So that all of these have come up in our research around pooling. Next, what are a few locations that you think could benefit from designated TNC stops? So public transit, colleges and universities, sporting events, employment sites, and restaurant areas. And all of these have also come up in our work. What are some elements? Let's see, having a little bit difficulty. What are some elements of your ideal pooled TNC ride experience? So this is what would be great to see. So we've got a tie here between designated pickup locations. So a big part of this research, trip times provided in advance, and meeting some great people. And one person also provided an other response. And then finally, if you were ordering a TNC for someone else, would your concerns change? And it looks like the vast majority of you answered yes to this. So yep, and that actually just increased real time to 82% saying yes, 1 person saying no, and 1 person saying do not know. So thanks so much for participating in the poll. It's really great to see the interaction this morning. So with that, Stephanie, I believe we'll start the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. We've already got a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so we'll just take each question one by one. The first question I have is, do you or is this research report currently available? If so, where can we find it?
Yes, so this research is completed. I have just submitted it and I'm waiting for it to just go through the final review process with NICR, and then it will become available through the NICR website. I will also make it available through my website at Berkeley, which is imr.berkeley.edu. And IMR stands for Innovative Mobility Research. I'll also plug it on social media as soon as it becomes available, but it is completed. So thanks for asking.
You're welcome. Well, yes, we will be sure to link that report from where the recording is as well when that's also available. So we just had one quick note that someone said, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very informative. And then this question comes with multiple, I'll read them all, and then if we need to address them one at a time, we can. It says, would it be interesting to consider the automation/connectivity of TNC vehicles? And then would these features change users' perspectives? And would it be meaningful to interview some Waymo users?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's like a perfect tee up to a brand new study that I was just awarded in partnership with others from the U.S. Department of Energy. We're really excited to be doing this research with Clemson University and an automated vehicle provider, a shuttle. And guess what? I'm going to be using photo voice method in that. And I think others may also really enjoy using this methodology with users as we get more experience with pooled vehicles. And I think Waymo users would be great if you can gain access to them. But I think, this was such an exploratory study for us. I really was excited about the method. I was excited about the question, and I really wasn't entirely sure what we would see. But I think what will be really interesting is to see this scaled and applied to other applications like automation and connectivity.
Perfect. I'm so glad to hear that you're going to be using this photo voice method again. Because that was going to be one of my next questions, was if you were going to be using it for further research.
Absolutely.
So, I'm glad to hear that.
Absolutely. I just loved it. And that workshop that I talked about, Stephanie, the private sector and public sector stakeholders and the NGO, they were just like, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating, because I think we're all kind of used to a focus group format, but this was so interactive, and you had the visuals, right? So people could really talk through what their concerns were. I think it was really amazing. I'm so delighted that we are able to modify this for COVID, but to also modify it for transportation. So anyway, I'm really excited about it, if you can't tell.
I'm sure other researchers that are currently listening may reach out to learn a little bit more about some of your great lessons learned through that experience. So let's go through the next couple of questions. Well, another note here, it says, congratulations on your DOE grant. Could you share a little bit more about that DOE project info? Is there a link available online to get more information about it?
Yeah, if you were to do a search on DOE grant, probably in just my last name, you can get a link on the CE website, the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department website that announces it, as well as the ITS Berkeley website. So we're working with Clemson University. We're deploying a lot of AV shuttles with Optimus Ride. And Optimus Ride is actually leading the project, and Berkeley has the lead on all the travel behavior research. We'll be looking at everything from impacts on parking, impacts on auto ownership, impacts on cycling for parking reductions. We'll be looking at equity effects, both gender and also people with disabilities, and just this will be such an exciting opportunity for us. We're going to be using existing routes, and then we're going to create a new route that goes into the downtown area to help with some employees who have been shifted off campus. That's happening at a lot of colleges and universities. And we're going to have late night service. We're going to get a chance to test a lot of different applications of shared automated vehicle technology on this campus over time. And we'll have a fair amount of vehicles out there. I believe we're going to have somewhere between 10 to 15 deployed at any one time. So hopefully that helps.
Perfect. I was Googling it as you were talking, and somebody was nice enough at the same time to post it in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is provide that link for everybody in the Q&A. So if you're interested in hearing or reading more about that opportunity, it is available for you. Unfortunately, there is not an opportunity to, someone notes that they'd like to ask a question verbally. There's not an opportunity for that.
Oh, I see that's John. Hi, John. Yeah, it's too bad I can't.
Hi, John.
Hi, John. John, can you type it in?
Hopefully he can. Let's ask another question while he potentially types it in. Let's see. I'm scrolling. Excuse me. Let me scroll up a little bit. Okay, here's the next question. It says, could you share more about the driver's side of the equation for incentives? As a rider, it's often unclear whether shared rides are a good deal or a bad deal.
Mm-hmm. So I have not researched this with drivers specifically. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you, I hear. It's more anecdotal. My understanding is that it typically is not a good deal for them, and it can cause stress because they may get rerouted. So that's, I think, another area for research is understanding better how pooling impacts the drivers and how it could be streamlined more to make it a more positive experience and motivating experience for them. I am doing another study for the Mineta Transportation Institute, and that report is just about out. We did do a driver survey there about curb and learned a lot about the stresses of drivers in terms of finding a place to park. And it is a very stressful experience for them. So they also are really big fans of, in many cases, these designated locations and carve outs of the curb, because they are under a lot of pressure to just keep moving. And they find distractions with other vehicles, in bikes and peds, for example, that may be weaving in and out. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, from an active transportation standpoint, but it's very stressful for them as well from their perspective. So thank you for that question. Did we get another question? Did we get John's question yet? No. Oh, there's John.
Yeah, there it is. I see it. I didn't scroll down. It says, describe how a pooled riding opportunity presents to the Uber user. It's at a point of ordering a ride on the app. Yes, if that's how it works on Lyft. Or she says,
yes.
That's how it works on Lyft.
Yes, the same. The same.
Okay, the next question comes in. It says, do the recommended policies require a lot of resources, for example, time, partnership commitments, in order to be implemented?
I think one of the observations that we had, Stephanie, from the workshop was that some of these would not necessarily be large-scale investments and things that might just require some smart thinking, engagement between the public sector and the private sector, and some paint or some reconfiguration of benches, maybe moving them, turning them around, or the creation of new clear infrastructure. So if people were waiting in the wind or the rain or the snow, that they would be protected. So I think one of the takeaways we had was that, some of this stuff may be not very expensive to do at all. Some could be done through the app, and some would be more expensive. For example, the incentives, of course, right? That's obviously going to be a more costly component, but in terms of the built environment and infrastructure and the wayfinding, virtual and physical, maybe not a huge financial commitment, and we could see notable payoff for that is what I meant.
Perfect. Okay, the next question says, do the key findings and policy recommendations reflect different equality concerns? For example, ridership challenges for non-English speakers, differences in service levels for wheelchair accessible vehicles?
Yes, so I didn't get into these details in the presentation itself, but recommendations definitely to reflect equity considerations is to ensure that we have multilingual communication with respect to wayfinding and ensuring that people are all able to access these services, and then definitely being very cognizant of people with disabilities when we're thinking about curb management and these potentially designated pickup locations. So I think there's a lot of work that we could do there, and we're hoping to pursue a lot of this through the DOE project as well.
Okay, so John has a follow-up question. He says, so do you have any database insight into why a user at the point of ordering a ride decides to click on pool yes versus pool no?
I'm not entirely sure, John, that I do. Like at that moment, right? So the research that was done here was more reflecting back on their experiences when they did have those options. But overall, we do have insights as to why they don't pool. And some of those are things that I mentioned in my interactive Q&A at the start of the session, things like those wait times, concerns about safety and security, who you might be in a vehicle with, or who you might be waiting with, and extended driving times. And a lot of that shows up in earlier work we've done on pooling. So that to pool or not to pool study, which is publicly available, shows this up. But like at that exact moment, that I think would be really interesting research, and I don't have that. Because that's going to give you
with a follow-up.
Very precise context, right, of what was going on in that moment.
Right. So he follows up with a comment. It says, with me, it comes down to the risk of the ride taking longer. Does it matter at that time for that trip versus not caring?
Exactly. So I think what's really important, right, is that context, John. I think it would be really neat to try to capture that. And how much is it the wait time, versus other factors.
He says thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Okay, I've got one more question here. It says, can the findings and policy recommendations be expanded to outside of the San Francisco Bay Area?
Great question. So with any type of exploratory research like this, we have to be careful about generalizability. But I think some of the findings are high level enough that people in other locations might want to consider investigating these further, particularly when you think about the wayfinding, the designated pickup, thinking about the lighting, locating designated pickup locations on well-lit streets, on wide sidewalks, those types of things. I don't think there's any harm in considering those things, but again, this is a very exploratory study. So we have to be careful about assuming that all of the results are transferable.
Okay, perfect, Susan. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions and or comments, so what I'm going to do right now is open up the evaluation for everybody on your end. So please take a few moments to complete that evaluation, as the feedback provided is not only very important to Susan, but the entire NICR webcast series. So we do have another webinar scheduled for September 23rd, so a little bit less than a month from today. Registration is open. We'll be hearing from our partners down at the University of Puerto Rico. This one will be specifically addressing influencing travel behavior via open source and the implementation of One Bus Away in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. So again, thank you to Susan for the great presentation. Thank you to everybody for all of your responses in the poll questions and for all of the great questions during the Q&A. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you on September 23rd. Bye, everybody.